Hey, thanks for listening to the show. If you like what you hear, consider supporting the show by donating on Patreon. Also, sign up to my email list on nikhilhogan.com for updates on my upcoming book, Why Children Quit Music, which is going to be like a bomb dropped on the music education world and hopefully get us thinking correctly on how to get our children to love learning music again. I mean, it can't be worse than what's happening right now with 90% of kids dropping their music instruments after their first year. It's going to be a great book. All right, let's get to the show. On today's show, we talk to the exciting up-and-coming video game composer, sound designer, and guitarist Joe Kataldo, responsible for many acclaimed video game soundtracks. We talk about the video game music industry, the gear he uses to compose, what his compositional process is like, and much, much more. Stay tuned. You're listening to The Nikhil Hogan Show. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Nikhil Hogan Show, the premier music interview show bringing you in-depth music conversations with some of the best musicians in the world. I'm delighted to introduce my guest today, exciting up-and-coming composer, sound designer, and guitarist Joe Kataldo. Kataldo is the founder and audio director of Madwave Audio, an audio production company that specializes on game audio. Some of the work he's done is music and sound design for The Last Night, a post-cyberpunk video game set in the world with a deep, vibrant vision for the future, HyPerParasite, an Italian twin-stick shooter, and sound design for the company Spaces. Kataldo regularly composes music for H3VR, a room-scale gun simulation VR experience for Oculus Rift, and HTC Vive, one of the top-selling VR games on Steam in 2018. Kataldo is a graduate of Berklee College of Music and the Conservatory of Napoli and holds degrees in music and composition. Hey Joe, welcome to the show.
Hi Nikhil, how are you?
Great to talk to you. Now, I'm absolutely fascinated by video game sound design, film sound design, composition. It's really, really a major, important part in the music industry. It's really worth billions of dollars and really is pretty much a vital part of the movie or the video game itself. So maybe you can really help me with this, so I'm very curious to know about it. So what do you mean by the term sound design? What does that are you designing sounds, custom sounds?
Let me say that it's definitely an amazing time to be in this field, especially video games, because the attention that's to this medium nowadays makes everything more exciting. And the specific of sound design, which is something that I got involved later on in my career. Well, what you do is you literally design sounds from sometimes sources that have nothing to do with what you see on the screen. So that's why we differentiate Foley, which is things like opening a door, like the door handle mechanics, or typing on a keyboard, from sound design, which is actually crafted by a variety of layers. So you can imagine something like maybe sci-fi weapons, a monster, everything that does not exist in reality, or everything that in reality doesn't sound that exciting as we would like to sound in a game or on the screen. Perhaps should we take like an example in particular?
Oh, let's take an example like Predator, the movie Predator. There's always Predator-like sounds that keep coming up in all the movies. So was that created by a sound designer back in the day that made a custom sound?
Yes, and what happened is that over time, certain sounds have become some kind of cliche, some kind of sounds that we expect a monster to sound like, an alien to sound like, a certain machine to sound like, a certain weapon to sound like in a certain way. They might have nothing to do with in the case of realistic object, the way they sound in reality. In the case of monsters, you find this cliche all over Hollywood. And somehow those have also, permeated into video games too.
It's interesting. So you're not just talking about music, you're also talking about the literal sound effects of the game itself or the film, like you said, or like opening doors and stuff. So are you responsible for doing everything?
The company, yes, the way we set up the company is like one-stop shop, and we also do implementation. So we create music, we create sound effects, and we also put those sounds into the game, which I think is what makes us stand apart in a way that iteration times, reviewing, and getting feedback from the client is way faster because we are the first to make the first decision if something sounds good enough or not, because we can test everything in game. So before we even present something to our client, we are the first to experience those sounds in the video game and see, okay, this works, this doesn't work, we need to fix it. And it's proved to be make the process much easier for our clients. But yes, sound design is creating all the sound effects for either a movie or a video game.
What's different about sound design and composition today in 2019 versus 20, 30 years ago? I mean, what has the technology changed?
We can definitely say that they're both nourishing each other. So we see a lot of more compositions that are heavily based, music compositions. They're heavily based in sound design. And we see the reverse is also true. You see sound designer pay more attention about the musicality, the notes, the frequency that also are some kind of musical notes in their sound design to make sure that they go very well with the music of a project. So the two fields are overlapping. And that's probably what fascinated me. As I started learning about sound design, I saw my composition improve, especially in the field of more action video games and sci-fi, first-person shooter video games. That blend of orchestral acoustic instruments mixed with sound design seemed to fit very well that style of video games. In terms of how it changed, well, definitely the way the way the user computer has changed everything in music production. So there is possibility of experiment and layer and manipulate sounds in a way that before had literally to be done by hand, like cutting the tape or speeding and pitching things down and up. And I would say that probably in the past there was more live field recordings where people went out and recorded actual objects or animals or whatever they needed to use as the base layers to create a sound maybe of an object that does not exist in reality. Nowadays, it's definitely easier to source all kind of strange recording and use them in your production for sound effects.
Regarding copyright, is that affected because maybe you might need to take a basic track and then manipulate it to a different... Like I remember the Jurassic Park T-Rex sound is like an elephant like flipped around and changed and all that kind of thing. So how does copyright work? Can you take copyright free things and then make it, or do you create a sound just fresh?
No, it's unlikely that you adapt something pre-made. So what you usually source also depends on the budget of a project. If most projects with a decent budget, they'll pay you for custom sound effects, just like you will write custom music. And so what you do is that you either record you either source your sound effects. So let's take one step back. We are not talking about library of sound effects. We're talking about library of what is called construction kits. So they are like raw recordings of any kind of object, of animal or a car or anything. And then from that, you use those layers to design original sound effects specifically for, let's take the example of a dinosaur, like the T-Rex. You will probably use a couple of strange or maybe exotic animals, mix them with an elephant or a tiger, and you manipulate those. So in terms of licensing, if you're starting with your own recording, clearly you own that, so you have no problem. And when it comes to sourcing this source recording, these construction kits of raw samples, usually they are sold as royalty free, so you can use them. There are also commercial library or pre-made sound effects, but usually those are very difficult to adapt to a project of a certain caliber. So it's probably a choice when you have to do, let's say, something in a very short amount of time and the budget for a project is very small. But so far, all my clients have requested like custom sound effects. It's the reason why you go to a professional. Otherwise, you can just buy those sound effects by yourself and someone can just put them in the game. I hope this makes sense. Answer your question.
It does. I'm very interested in the craft of making it. And did you study film scoring and contemporary writing and production?
Actually was a mix. I did contemporary writing major, which was a mix of music for advertising, libraries, TV, movies, but I didn't go for the film scoring program. I felt like contemporary writing offered more a variety of styles than just film scoring. And I did not study sound design at all. Sound design is something that came up just by experience of doing it later on.
Did you notice that a lot of people wanted that influenced your direction?
I see this all the time. There's people starting in a field, and then just because of how their career developed, they end up in some completely different fields. There is orchestrator that become composer because that's what happened. There is like people that want to be like songwriters and end up being engineers. And sometimes, it's hard to predict in music. It's a tough business. It's very competitive, and what happens that one gig will lead to another, and then sooner or later you might, maybe you take a side gig because you needed the money, but you did an excellent job, and then people start recognizing you, let's say, for being a mixing engineer, which is not what you wanted to do, and all of a sudden you're
doing that.
Start calling, yeah, you're doing that, and it's actually you need to be careful because people tend to put you in a category.
Let's talk about the actual composition of the music now. Okay, so music, that's going to involve musical notes. You have to know your knowledge, your theory. First of all, it really depends on the project, right? So let's take The Last Night. Now, the description for The Last Night is post-cyberpunk. So people are going to imagine a city, like sci-fi a little bit, cyborgs. Do you look at movies like Blade Runner for ideas? Do you look at scores that were scored in the 80s and 70s for that feel? Or do you come up with your own thing? Do you try and reinvent the wheel?
Obviously, the challenge is to try to bring something new that has not done before, which is extremely difficult nowadays. Everything has been done, and we are influenced by everything, and with that also includes like old movies and movies that come before in the same genre. Unfortunately, there is not much I can tell you about The Last Night because it's not been out yet. So it's something that's still being discussed in terms of direction of music. But yes, movies like Blade Runner are definitely a big influence, and it's impossible to not be influenced by such a masterpiece. Especially for a movie like that was so ahead of their time.
So did you watch it, and then did you keep an eye for the music and that kind of thing?
Well, I do that all the time. It's not just for The Last Night, but for everything I watch. I feel like you're a musician too. It's impossible to turn off that analytical sense of music when you have it. So sometimes I might watching TV, and I was like, oh, I really like how they use this chromatic gradient chord progression to highlight that the monster is about to show up soon.
So, Joe, do you have perfect pitch or good relative pitch?
No, I don't.
I don't. Very strong relative pitch.
I have a very good relative pitch, absolutely. But I don't have the perfect pitch.
Did you do a lot of transcriptions before? For instance, I'm seeing here that Vangelis wrote music for Blade Runner. So let's say there's a movie that you liked and you liked a certain move. Would you transcribe it or try and buy the score?
I will go further than that. I really like what I'll give you another example. I really like how to the music that John Powell did, how to train your dragon, and I would go further than transcribing it. I will actually recreate a mock-up in MIDI of the whole piece, of the whole orchestra. That really gives me a chance to zoom in every line, because I have to play every single line that the orchestra plays on the keyboard to recreate their arrangement. And so I used to do a lot of those. I used to do as a job for other composer, but also I used to do it for myself. I felt it was a step forward beside doing just score reading and learning from the score. I could actually even see, because once you have that mock-up, then you can isolate section and you can listen let me just now zone in on how the brass section works in connection with the percussion section, or just how the strings are orchestrated. So the answer is yes, both transcribing, listening, looking at the score, and sometimes even recreating the orchestra with the computer to really understand the nuts and bolts of a score and the way it's orchestrated.
You mentioned making a mock-up. So how do you do that in your computer? And what can you describe your rig?
Absolutely. How in depth do you want me to go?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm very curious.
Like super nerdy, just you and I will understand.
Okay, you just start, and I'll tell you if I'm lost.
So I'll describe you what is the common setup that, let's say 99% of the composer have here in LA. It's usually a system of between 3 to 4 computers, if not more. There is a main central computer that's used to run the software. In my case, it's a Cubase, and that it's only responsible to send the MIDI and the mixing of the project. It doesn't host any virtual instruments. Then that communicates with another software called VN Ensemble Pro via LAN cable to 2 very powerful Dell servers. I'm talking about like 256 gigabyte of RAM each, like a dual 10-core Xeon CPU. These are monsters computers. So what happens is these two huge machines with all SSD drives, they host all the orchestral samples, all the plugins, all the virtual instruments. And so the main computer sends MIDI to those machines via LAN, and those machines send back audio, again, through the LAN cable. And this allows you to have massive templates in the order of like 1,500 tracks to 3,000 tracks, and all of them can play in real time so that you can use them to compose music. And a master keyboard to control of that. Another common thing that you'll find in many studios is some kind of touch control to be able to quickly change all the different articulations for all these virtual orchestral instruments. So, for example, to switch string section from legato, staccato, if you need to select different mutes for the brass, and things like that. So it's usually a multi-computer system. It's the only way that allows you to work very fast. With sometimes even some of the simplest queue can have 300, 400 tracks.
Now, you mentioned that you can recreate the sound with MIDI. So nowadays there's this thing called VSTs, right, which you can purchase and you can use to create like almost an artificial orchestra right in your studio. You can actually use MIDI to recreate a full orchestra. What kind of libraries do you use? And the computer, is it a Linux or is it Windows?
So since I work in video games, all my computers are PC. People that used to work in game audio historically have used mostly PC because some of the software used for making games were not even available on Mac at certain point in times. But there is definitely a shift from Mac to PC. Seems like everyone is switching to PC nowadays, even here in LA, just because Apple is changing the direction that they're taking with their Mac Pros and laptops. They're not really interested in serving professional user. They're moving more to pro consumer kind of thing. So it's all PC, it's all Windows 10. The server run Windows servers editions. They're specific, the specific versions.
And the VSTs? So
the VSTs, there is a standard that has become the number one soft sampler, which is Contact, made by Native Instruments. So it's what in the 80s and 90s those huge hardware sampler used to be. And now it's all done in software. And in terms of sample libraries, I have there's an infinity of them. So I would say, let me just clarify something. What really improved, I will say, it's not really the VST. Obviously, the concept of VST that was introduced a long time ago has changed how we write music with the computer. But it's the quality of the sample libraries that has improved to the point where the samples are not just there to replace the orchestra. They also are starting to bring a certain quality to scores that the humans cannot do. They provide punchiness and ultra precisions. And so most movie soundtracks that you hear nowadays are always a blend of the two. The orchestra is there because you're never going to be able to replace what a 100-piece orchestra can give you. But the samples are not discarded once the orchestra is recorded, but they're blended in for certain specific things, like for very aggressive staccato strings, for very aggressive percussions, for the punchiness and the tightness that the instrument can have since it's a machine. Things that you will think like they will make the performance less human, they actually it ends up being like we like it. We like the combination. Other things they're often used is to save money on things that are very particular and difficult to record, or like harmonics on strings or special effects. And also things that musician might not be super happy to do, like, for example, using collegno battuto when you like hit the strings with the other side of the violin bow, like especially if they're like world-class musicians and have a bow that's like $300,000. But to give you an idea, I just want to point it out that the sample started as a way to create demos. demos that were meant to be replaced later on by the live orchestra. But now the samples are so good that one, you can definitely provide for smaller project music without using real instruments. And even when there is the budget there's millions of dollars of budget to record a live orchestra either in LA or in London, composers still leave the samples in because of how the blend works and the things I was mentioning before.
When it comes to the notation of all of this, I've noticed that a lot of people are doing things in MIDI. Is there a need for music notation in this world, other than getting notes for your orchestra to play? But beyond that, when you're working in the studio, do you actually use much music notation?
Not at all. It's only needed if you need to, for two cases. If you need to record live musicians, as you were saying, if you're putting on a live show, or if you need to just export the main melody to register copyright.
Right.
That's only. But if it's all done in the box, there is absolutely no need to write the music.
That's amazing.
You are the performer. I am the one that's performing every single line on a keyboard in MIDI for the whole orchestra, for everything that's played. You had a great one of the best arranger orchestrator here in LA. You had Tim Davis some time ago. I'm sure he touched this topic. Even nowadays, the composer don't even take care of the notation. What they will send MIDI or even the whole session to an orchestrator like Tim, and then Tim is in charge of creating. Someone like Tim is in charge of actually creating the score, and then after that, someone else will do the parts. So composers are rarely notating the music themselves anyway. And it's not because they don't know how to do it. It's just the way the whole business works. Everything has to be done so fast. So while the composer finishes a cue and sends it to the orchestrator, he needs to start writing more music. So he does not have the time to do all those steps.
Now, let me ask you about the market sound in film music. So I've noticed that certain people have very identifiable sounds. So for instance, Hans Zimmer has a Hans Zimmer sound. And in film scoring, you tend to hear John Williams has a very distinctive sound. That is filtered down. Do people, when they're composing for certain scenes, are you noticing that, for instance, in a fight scene, there's a certain rhythmic pulse to a fight scene typically nowadays? You're not going to have an ambient fight scene, but do you find that there's a homogeneous kind of sound? Are people trying to match the market in terms of what things should sound, or is it more dangerous to try and compose something too fresh that it doesn't fit what everyone expects?
Yes and no. The answer is yes and no. Definitely everyone has a sound, and that sound comes from years and years of finding what you like. And the things that you like in music, the things that you decide to use and not use in your composition, mostly the things that you decide to not use in your composition, because with samples you can have any weird instrument in this world, is what defines you as a musician, as a composer. I think it's extremely important to have that unique voice. At the same time, on another level, clients, even when they tell you that they want the most unique things, then when you provide it, they won't like it. And so often we do tend to fall into those cliche of, fast and overused chord progressions, rhythmic pulses, and orchestration that defines certain moments, either in a movie or in a game that the larger public has grown accustomed to recognize. I hear the low, deep, droney kind of thing. I know the bad guy is about to arrive. that kind of thing, right? When you hear boom,
what is that bomb?
Just a low drone or some sound effects, just like Hans Zimmer. He became kind of famous for those low hits that he did on Inception, and now everyone is copying them. There's always going to be someone that sets a trend, and then people are going to copy it, and it's inevitable. Keep in mind, my work is mostly in video games, so there we have a little bit more of experimentation. At least that's what I've experienced so far. And it's probably one of the reasons why I really like video games. I feel like the game directors are kind of they want the quality that the Hollywood movie production provide in terms of music and production, but at the same time they don't want to copy it. There is more of a search for something unique, something that has not been done before. I remember discussing this with my friend and game director Tim Soray from The Last Night. We were like, what if there is a fighting scene, for example, in the game, and instead of putting the usual, as you were describing, the usual like fight scene pulse that tells me, oh, they're about to fight. We put that silence. We don't put anything, right? And we have the music to come in after the main character, for example, has killed everyone in a room. And so the music in this case is what he feels. Is like in the moment of the action, it was just responding to a threat. It was just that response that he wanted to save his life. And then once he finally succeeded and he saved his life, but has killed a bunch of people, he realized, oh my God, I've killed a bunch of people. So the music comes in as a very sad. So I think it's fun to play with this kind of contrast, and it's done in movies too.
I'm going to ask you what your favorite kind of scenes are in movies. There was actually, what you just said reminded me of like the Lord of the Rings. I remember the Fellowship of the Ring, that first fight in the cave in Moria. Is the music really building up, and then when the actual fight happens, it's silence, and then you just hear sound effects, and then the music only comes back near the end of the fight. But let me ask you now, what are your favorite in music and video games? Let's just give me an example of something that you've used and incorporated and made into your own style. And it could be from a video game or it could be from a film.
So in terms of what I was describing, I think I first noticed this idea in the movie Drive. I think it was Drive, where all the fighting scenes had no music. And so you could really have the sound design come out and which give the scenes a very crude and violent sound, and by having then the music coming as a contrast, it really helped create that. I don't know. It made it pop from the screen. It really touched me. In terms of movies the movie scenes that I really liked, well, there's so many. Let's say I'm a big fan of the opening How to Train Your Dragon. With the whole flying scene. I think the cue's called. This is Berk. It's just when the story starts and introduce everything, and the music is amazing, and just the way it supports the narration and the storytelling there. Something like some genre in particular, some style in particular, like for video games, like Medal of Honor. It's probably is one of the biggest games. Like when those moments of battle starts, the music is so evocative, and I think that's Michael Giacchino. At least the Medal of Honor I'm thinking about, and this was all recorded with live orchestra. I think it started in video game, and then one of the producers from Lost played the game and heard his music, and I think they want to. Yeah, that was an interesting transition. I might be totally wrong. I don't.
No, I think I've heard that too. You might be right.
I think that's how it went. Yeah, I think that's how the story went. You see a lot of people transitioning from movies to video games and from video games to movies. The two medium are becoming more similar day after day.
Isn't video games, the industry, larger than the film industry?
It is. It's crazy the amount of money and the amount of production that there are, but also in general, like Modern Warfare 3 made more money than when it was released, like in a week, made more, or in a day, something like crazy, more money than Avatar made in a week, something like that. And I think Avatar was one of biggest sales ever.
How about Grand Theft Auto? That has, that's a huge game.
Yes,
billions of dollars.
About like huge.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. I want to keep going on the composition. Let me get your take on film music, video game music. What I've noticed is rock and pop musicians have also kind of jumped into the composition and film and you're starting to hear almost pop progressions sometimes in film. And then the more traditional people have a classically trained composition background, so they study harmony, and then that you can hear that in their compositions. For you, what's your approach to the actual music, and do you use theory that you've studied in school, or you from your own experience did you study and chord progressions and melodic ideas? What is your process for the music?
It's a mix of both, and what you're noticing is 100% true. In the past 10, 20 years, we're starting to hear more and more pop chord progressions, masked by orchestral compositions, if we can call that. But I think it's a natural process. My background comes from playing in guitar, so as a performer. Then actually before that, I was in classical music a lot. because of the background of my family. So I was trained as a classical violin player. Then I went to guitar. Then I went to more pop rock kind of harmony and theory. And then I went back to studying more traditional harmony, orchestration, and classical composition. So I definitely draw inspiration. And jazz, obviously. We both went to Berklee, so you know how intense is the harmony program there. So we definitely, I draw from everything. I don't set myself any rule. So it could be a pop progression. It could be more classical. And by classical, I mean like 19th century romantic kind of chord progression. It depends on the project, and he was in charge of the direction.
It's so interesting that you use a certain language for a certain. You really have to have a huge library in your head to know what you can draw from. So what?
I think that's what it comes down. You're 100% right. It's like a library of ideas and or chord progression that evoke a certain mood. So I would say it's a library of moods that you know how to create with certain chord progressions.
I want you to explain to me a typical process. So let's take H3VR, which was, one of the top-selling VR games on Steam. Now, when you're writing music for that, can you give a sample session of what you were doing?
I can describe it. One of the last modes that we did, which was it was a horror kind of return of the zombie kind of thing. That we did. The game has multiple modes that get released consistently, sometimes even themed, let's say for Halloween, for Christmas, or based on some movie that was successful. For example, they did a mode that was inspired by Westworld. So it changes a lot for each one of these modes. But to give you an example, for that one, my inspiration was I actually watched a lot of X-Files. I know it's not really related to zombies, but I really love the work that Mark Snow does.
Yeah, right?
Yeah, he did, especially on the very first episodes, how he create that those tense mood and scary moods. And
did he pioneer a lot of those sounds? I mean, did that all come from the mind of Mark Snow, or was he borrowing as well a lot?
I can't.
It's hard to say.
I can't be 100% sure, but some of those chord progression you also find them in Stravinsky, so the HyPerParasite. So I can say that he pioneered them about it, but definitely the chromatic median is another one. Like if you go from C minor to E minor, that's overused. It's a common overused two chord progression that. Back to H3VR, I can because we did a very unique thing with that project. We actually had the time. So this was okay. So I was approached the beginning of October to release half-hour music, around 8 tracks, for Halloween mode, and it's a mix of horror, shooting, but also sci-fi elements. That's why I went for inspiration to movies more like X-Files instead of traditional like Return of the Zombies and the Dawn of the Living Dead, movies like that, because the game has some kind of elements of you're in this world and you know that something is wrong, but you can't figure out what it is. So for me, that's why X5 was a great inspiration. So I spent about a week of pre-production where I literally looked around myself for weird sounds, and I also went online and I ordered all kind of weird instruments from real donkey jaw bones, a box with some springs on it, an Aztec death whistle, a theremin, a real tail of a rattlesnake. I also bought a waterphone, which is something in between a musical instrument and a metal sculpture that you put water in it and you play with a violin bow. So all kind of strange things. I also built some. I bought like an aluminum bucket and put some guitar strings through it and tried to tune them for all kind of crazy sounds. I actually have a video on YouTube where I show behind the scene all of this on my YouTube channel that people can check it out. But so we spent a whole week recording, creating, starting from actual acoustical instruments, a palette of sounds that I was hoping it would work for a horror soundtrack. And then with that, after the first week, I brought it into the computer. And into the computer, I start tuning things. Because, for example, the string bucket was impossible to actually, with the guitar string, was impossible to actually tune it to a precise note. So with the use of software and editing in Pro Tools, I tune it to something that's still playable without losing the sense of oddness. And I turned some of those instruments into samples for Contact, the software that we were talking about. So this is something I try to do all the time. And also it connects with what you were trying to say before. Having a unique voice that's recognizable in this industry, it's not a bad thing. It's actually an amazing thing. And that's what I try to do to compete here in LA, where there is like composer that are years and years ahead of my careers, and they own every possible synthesizer, software or hardware, every possible plugin, every million, thousands of dollars of sample libraries. It's impossible to compete with them if you want to compete on the quality of your plugins. But you can compete with them as a starting composer if you can have unique sounds that only you have and no one else has. Because literally, I built some of these instruments that I use. And I turn them into custom sample libraries that sometimes are also used on other composition later on. I add them to my template. And after that, I just started writing for the game. And the way it goes is that the director will give me certain moods that he wants for certain areas of the game or certain scenes of the game or describing the action. And that's how you start working on it. You start with a drafting process. You start sending a draft, and says, "That's this work for the mood that you're thinking about." It says, "Yeah, this works. No, I want it more scary." Usually, we never talk about in terms of actual music theory.
With the drafting process, do you have a quick mock-up that you show the director?
It's a very good question, and I tell you why it's tricky, because not everyone is capable to foresee the finished product. So sometimes you provide draft. They are almost finished track because you want them to sound as good as possible to make sure that a good idea is not discarded just because it was in an early stage and it was not polished enough for someone else to like it. So sometimes the tracks are almost finished, but what they don't have yet the interactive part, because video game music compared to film is split up in multiple parts and chunks, and it's more modular. It's made in layers so they can adapt to the different action that's happening in the game, and in the way that it follow the action following the action of the game.
Now, you mentioned a theremin. Now, if you're composing with a theremin in mind, what key signatures are you thinking of, and how does that work musically? Like if you're thinking of the actual composition, or do you experiment?
It's all an experiment process. I had, for example, no idea I was actually able to make any musical sounds from the aluminum bucket with the guitar string on it. So a lot of it, that's the beauty of having a decent budget and enough time to work on a project. You have the time to fail. And by having the time to fail, you also have the time to experiment and come up with unique things. And since in terms of the theremin, the very specific of it, I looked at its range and so I based the composition around that. But most of these instruments were also used as sound design elements. So they were supposed to be musical, but they were not necessarily meant to be the leading voice of the composition.
Now, recently there was an interview with Ennio Morricone, and he blasted directors. He said something like, a lot of them, very few, understand music. And it's sometimes, it's very difficult because they'll do something and a director. This is, I guess it's about film. Now, what is your challenge as a musician, a composer, working with a director, and you know that you're more trained, but how do you kind of bridge that gap of knowledge and make something that they're happy with, but also, you might have a strong idea of what is quality, and it might not. They just because of their lack of training, they won't understand the craft that goes into what you've just done.
It's definitely a challenge to convince them if you have a good idea, what you think that's if you think you have a good idea that is going to work for the movie, but they're not convinced. And sometimes it's part of your job to sell them your music, to convince them, to sell them on your ideas. But I want to make a couple of things clear. I think that article you're referring to about Morricone was later on debunked as a fake.
Oh, it's fake. Fake news.
I'm not 100% sure, but he created all kind of outrage online.
Yeah.
And everyone was shocked that he was saying things like that. But even if it was a fake, that is definitely a problem, because you're dealing with people that have to judge your work that might not be trained. And it's not just the training in the sense they don't know how to play an instrument, but it's also training in the sense their ears might not be trained to appreciate certain level of dissonance or a certain level of complex harmony. But I have to be honest, this kind of problem only happened to me when I was working in advertisement, and often I will have like as feedback, as notes that will tell me sounds too jazzy. Like by that they meant I used a minor 7 chord instead of like a 1-4-5 major pop chord progression. In the world of video games, so far I've been very, very lucky. All the producers I worked with and the directors, I've had either exceptional good taste in music, or they trusted me, or they had very good suggestion that in the end made my work better. So I might be a little biased because of my personal experience, but so far I have never been in that position where I strongly felt I had the best music in this world, and the director didn't like it and be like, nah. Yeah.
Now you mentioned let's talk about LA, and it's really responsible for a lot of the entertainment that goes out into the world. You mentioned the market standard for the rig of LA. How many composers are there in LA walking around? How many jobs are there? Can you give an idea of what's happening in LA for somebody who has no idea about the industry?
It is crazy. I'm laughing because right next to me, I went to a networking event, and the only business cards that I found in my pockets are from 4 composers. So I feel extremely lucky that I'm able to make a living writing music and even doing sound design. But the market is extremely competitive. It's extremely competitive for everyone, and even more if you were not born here or if you didn't go to a school that allow you to form certain connection with people that later on have succeeded and then can give you a hand and help you in the business. Everyone comes here and they want the same thing, and there's only a certain amount of gigs. And not just that, but some of the most famous composers in the world also are here working. I'm only a 40 minutes drive from Hans Zimmer studio. But at the same time, I have a different philosophy about this, that perhaps something more positive about it, not to discourage someone that wants to start in this field and maybe wants to move to LA. I think that if you cannot succeed in LA, you'll not succeed anywhere else. There's so much work and everything is happening here. So it's definitely a positive and good environment. What I'm trying to say is that this is the place to be where you'll meet people that work in the business that you want to get in, even randomly. I think my landlord, if I remember right, he used to be Hans Zimmer's first movie agent. Just to give you an idea. And that happened totally random. So just the way you meet people here, a good chunk of the population here is in entertainment. It makes sense to be here.
Now, LA, do you mean just the city of Los Angeles itself specifically?
Los Angeles area and Burbank, Studio Cities, where all the big studios are, like Warner Brothers is. A lot of composers even live in the areas around it. But yes, in LA and the LA city area. It's not like you need to be downtown LA, but being here, it's important. It's definitely important. I'll only be here for 2 years, but the way my career developed, it would have been impossible if I stayed in Boston, and even less if I was in Italy. I meet in person with most of my clients. Yes, there's Skype, but for certain project, no one is going to trust you if you don't meet them in person. And it's a little bit misunderstood that a lot of people think like, I can work from wherever there is internet. Sure, but not.
It's a little bit harder than it seems. Now you've done what people have dreamed of. You've moved there and you've started. Now you have a career there. Now, how does one do that? Like, for instance, if you were to talk to somebody who's studying what you're doing right now, and they wanted to move to LA, like, what are the 5 things they have to do to start earning money to pay their rent and to start getting to know people and getting gigs that they would like to aim for?
It's very tough, and there is no straight line and there's no definitive answer to this. But I have asked this question many times because of the popularity of H3VR and The Last Night. I get a lot of people, and they ask me, how did you get in that gig? How did you get that gig? How that happened? And uh, for me, for example, it started like randomly. I was not even thinking about video games until it started. But in the specific, to give more of a practical advice here in LA, first of all, it definitely helps to be in the city where everything is happening. You'll have way more chances to succeed here than if you live in Boston and if you live in, I don't know, any other city that it's not a major hub in terms of in production. So that definitely helps. And then you need to network. I feel like the biggest mistake that people make is, and it's a little sad because it puts the arts and the craft in second place. But the number one skill that you need to have is the skill of getting work, getting gig. It's your job. Your skills in then providing the music, providing the sound design, and having a certain level of professionalism, that's assumed because everyone has it. When you get at a certain level, everyone can write amazing music. Everyone can write amazing sound. It can create amazing sound effects. So what you really need to get good at is people skills, and not necessarily like the fake thing where you like, you start throwing business cards at everyone. But you need to have a genuine interest for meeting people, meeting new people, and go out and trying to meet young film directors and game directors, go to conventions, networking event. That's the beauty of being in LA. There is an event every single night. You could go somewhere where you connect with a producer, an agent, other film composers, studios, and game directors. There is everything happens here. In terms of practical advices, well, first of all, it's a little bit of a leap of faith. I left Boston without. I had a pretty decent. I was making decent money teaching in a couple of schools, and I was already working on some video games there. So I had no reason to move. If I wanted to stay there, I was doing pretty fine. So first of all, you need to have the drive of wanting more in terms of career. Like it's not enough for me to just have the little things in my town. And so not be scared. I packed my whole studio, drove from Boston to LA.
Really, you drove?
Yeah, I did the whole drive.
Oh, my goodness.
By that time, I had stayed after school a couple of years in Boston, so I already had like a pretty decent studio. I was not going to sell everything and buy everything again. It would have cost me too much money. I would have lost too much money. It's very specific gear. It's difficult to sell. So it only made sense to I could have shipped everything, but the fun, I wanted to do the drive for fun. It's definitely a fun thing to do at least once in your lifetime. Once here, all I can tell you is that I was unemployed for around 6 months, and then I have worked since then nonstop to the point that I don't have weekends anymore. I have lost a little bit of my social life. So there is definitely a lot of work here. It takes a little bit of everything: courage, a certain level of craft and experience in doing what you do, and luck is involved in it. But number one skill is being good at connecting with people. And so in specific of video games, there is a lot of convention that you can go and start meeting potential clients. That's it. I'm flying, for example, to GDC in 2 weeks in San Francisco. That's one of the biggest conferences. There is E3, there is PAX East, PAX West. There's all kind of convention that you can go where you can meet potential clients. And I have met people there that then led to actual contracts.
Since time's running out, let's do the fun hot seat questions now. All right, so these are fun, so you don't have to really worry about what you say. Okay, so let's start with video games. So who are your top 3 video game composers in your opinion?
Oh, okay. I don't think it changes. Well, let me say the category changes. So I really like some of the work that Brian Tyler did on Modern Warfare, and he's not a video game composer. He mostly works on film. Bear McCrae is also another TV composer, but he did an awesome job in most recent God of War. And I really like the guy that did the soundtrack for the most recent Doom. That was very good.
Mick Gordon?
Yes, Mick Gordon. He created this blend of I'm a guitar player, so that's why I like that. He created this blend of progressive metal and synthesizers and sound design. It's like crazy, and it's very, very good.
That's actually really interesting because if you don't have a background in that kind of music, it'll be very difficult for you to kind of just make an authentic sounding version of it that's going to be quality, right?
I have to disagree with that. I find myself writing music in styles that I would have never imagined I could do. And I think it comes back to the sense of aesthetics. If you have a good sense of aesthetic for what sounds good and what is good in music, then you just have to dress it in different styles. At least this is my experience. But I also come from a very diverse background. I played in bands and I played in orchestra. I played violins, classical music, and I also played electric guitar. So I have a little bit of both. But most recently, I did a track, and it was like the 70s spy with vibraphones and very jazz chord progression. And then I also did a retro synthwave tracks with only hardware instruments. I didn't use any computer. The computer was only used to record. So it was like synthesizers from the 80s, like drum machines, old Yamaha drum machines and things like that. Things I had never done before. And they seem to work. And the only reason why I can explain to me why that still doesn't sound good, it's because at the core, there is my sense of aesthetic, what I think sounds good, pretty much what I like, the way I shape things and I compose music with what I like. And then the ensemble and the orchestration, it becomes just a way you dress these ideas up. But if you, at the core, you reduce them to chords and melodies, they will work on piano, they will work on anything.
Now let's keep moving. So top 3 film composers.
John Williams, John Powell, Hans Zimmer, you have to mention it. Well, Ennio Morricone, there's too many. I cannot do Alexander Desplat. I cannot do just like top 3. It's impossible. It's impossible. They're all so good. It's like, who's your favorite guitar player?
Oh, I'll get to that. But okay, now let's talk about classical composers now. So who are your favorite classical composers, 19th century and backwards?
Like Brahms. I'm really a sucker for all this orchestral work. I haven't listened to classic music of the era in a long time.
But you like the modern ones?
Yes. Xenakis, which I think is still alive. It is a contemporary composer. Is he Greek? He does all kind of strange things. Yeah, he does like all kind of strange things with orchestra. And he was already using electronics and DJs live performing with him.
Now, you mentioned guitarists. Let's do that. So you have to name me 3, just 3 favorite guitarists.
Okay, Frank Gambale is one of my favorite. Steve Vai, John Petrucci. Yeah, that could be my 3-1.
Name 3 video games scores. Yeah, the top 3 video game scores.
Top 3 video game scores?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go. Well, Medal of Honor, I think it was, I had a subtitle, but I can't remember it. I think it's Allied Assault, something like that. But that Medal of Honor was, I loved that soundtrack a lot. The Quake 2 soundtrack was amazing, done by, I think it's a German composer, lives here in Sasha Dikia. I'm not going to pronounce it right. I don't know how it's pronounced. But it was that industrial electronic acoustic instrument blend that I really like. More recent, the God of War soundtrack is amazing by Barry McCreary. I can keep going. It's like they're so good nowadays. They're like the work in video game. It's no longer like this blips and blop sounds that video games used to be. The soundtracks now as good as movies.
Okay, now what was the hardest composition that you had to write in your career?
Oh, everyone's difficult. every composition.
Name one experience that you found like, wow, this is hard.
Let's see. I would say no. I think like if it's hard, then there is something wrong. There is something that you have not understood yet. It's not the writing process that's hard. It's usually either the deadline or you haven't figured out yet. You haven't unlocked yet what the project needs, what the games needs. Yeah, I can't remember something that was that difficult that like I was banging my heads for days and I couldn't figure out.
On the flip side, can you name a really easy piece that you felt very proud of, that it just flowed?
If it's a guitar composition, that just flows. If it's a composition where it's geared more like the riffing and has guitars in it, then that flows because I'm a guitar player. I've played guitar my whole life, so I know the language of that music very well. So that's just fun. That comes out very natural. I would say maybe one that was difficult. I did a track once which was piano and cello, and that was fairly challenging to get the right mood. It was like a very sad track for a library, meant for I think the scene was like someone either dying or waking up from a coma in a hospital bed, and it was very challenging to not overdo it, to not either give up, underline the emotion too much or too little.
What game was that? For a game, or was that for
No, this was a library, for a music library, so music that then gets licensed to TV and TV shows.
What is your favorite sample, or top 3 samples? Do you have any?
But in terms of we can give them, like, if we want to be specific to give advice, we can divide them in categories.
Okay.
So for orchestral strings, I really like cinematic studio strings. For brass, the Spitfire symphonic brass are very good. For woodwinds, Berlin woodwinds, that's the name of the library, are extremely good. They took the time to actually record flute number 1, flute number 2, and auxiliary flute, for example, by different players. So it's not just the same samples, like copy and paste a couple of times to create a wind ensemble. I'll tell you something unique. I don't actually use VST synthesizers. I made long time ago a choice to not use any sampled or like synthesized synth sounds. So, for example, like I don't use any Omnisphere, which every film composer does. I don't use any Massive or FM8, all the stuff from Native Instruments. I use those I use software synthesizers for sound design, but when it comes to composition, I collect vintage and actual hardware synthesizers. So I use those. It takes way more time because you have to program them. You cannot just like record the patches like you can do with VST, and you need to make sure you properly save them in case you need to do changes to a track and they break and things like that. But it goes back to what I was telling you before. I'm trying as much as possible to have a unique voice, and so wherever I can, I cannot afford to have my own custom samples for a string orchestra, but I can decide to use unique synthesizer. A percussion is something that I custom record a lot to try to have a unique voice.
Well, Joe, I mean, it's such a pleasure to talk to you, and I know I'm going to see your name in one of these major video games pretty soon.
Pretty soon. There's actually a couple of projects there. They're going to be AAA titles, but unfortunately can't talk about this yet. I'm sure we'll have another chance to have a chat.
We absolutely will. Do you want to plug a few of the projects that you have released and are excited that you are able to talk about? So just so that the listeners can check it out and maybe purchase them.
Yes, definitely. You can go out online and either my website or my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Joe Kataldo. You can check out the behind the scene for H3VR. Also, you can listen on my SoundCloud. It's the same thing, soundcloud.com/Joe Kataldo. You can listen to the soundtrack for free. And we are also releasing all the music on YouTube too, with some videos. And we decided to release the music. The publisher decided to release the music for free. So that's a cool thing. If you're interested in the project, you can check out the games, and if you want to buy it on Steam. HyPerParasite is coming in late spring. I only did some additional music for it. It's full of retro, vintage, synthwave music. So if you're in that 80s kind of vibe, it's an amazing game. Just for the music to play it. There is an upcoming Oculus Go, Oculus Quest video game. It's going to be one of the most advanced first-person shooter VR game ever done on only one headset. I cannot talk about that because it's not been announced yet, but it should be out soon. But definitely go check out the soundtrack for H3VR, and check my YouTube channel if you're curious about some of the weird things I mentioned before. So you can see them, and you can find out more about this.
Well, Joe, I'm really excited to bring you back to talk about these upcoming projects as well. But thank you so much. I've learned a lot today about the industry, and I wish you all the best. I know you're going to be a big name in the future.
Thank you. Absolutely. And it was more than a pleasure to do this, especially considering like the roster of people have interviewed. It's like amazing. Like it's an honor.
Well, Joe, yeah, you definitely deserve it, and it'll be so exciting to hear about your upcoming projects. Thanks again for spending the time talking to us, and have a great day.
You too, Nikhil. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening to my interview with the exciting Joe Kataldo. He's going to be a huge name in video game music, mark my words. And I hope you had a good time listening to the interview as well. Please consider donating to my Patreon if you'd like to support the show. Don't forget to sign up to my email list on nikhilhogan.com for updates on my upcoming book, Why Children Quit Music. And be sure to follow the show on social media. Thanks again, and I'll see you at the next show.